Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller.
One of the shocks of October 7 is that Israel had not at all expected Hamas to attack. Another shock, especially in the diaspora, is that some Jews joined the pro-Palestinian protest in which Israel, not Hamas, is blamed, condemned, and demonized. Our guest today has a psychological perspective on these phenomena. Kenneth Levin is a psychiatrist and historian in Newton, Massachusetts. He's the author of The Oslo Syndrome, Delusions of a People Under Siege. In this book, he describes how a population that is chronically besieged, like Israel and the Jewish people, may embrace some of their enemies' indictments, blame themselves for the siege, and choose to believe that if they reform themselves sufficiently, their enemy will be placated. Levin is a clinical instructor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. After he published his book on the Oslo Syndrome, he became a frequent commentator on Middle East affairs. Kenneth, welcome to our show, and it's wonderful to have you on.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, can you please briefly describe to us what the Stockholm Syndrome is and what the variant is that you introduced, the Oslo Syndrome?
Yes, the Stockholm Syndrome, the term derives from a bank robbery that occurred several decades ago in the Swedish capital, in which several people were taken hostage and locked in the bank vault for 5 days with the robbers, and they emerged very much sympathetic to the robbers, identifying with them to some degree, and that was the concept of the syndrome. It's an old psychological concept to some degree. It was discussed by Anna Freud in terms of what she called identification with the aggressor.
Yeah.
But that is the essence of the Stockholm Syndrome. Now, the Oslo Syndrome, obviously, titling my book that, which is about the Oslo process and how, in some ways, it was reflective of the same kind of psychology. Obviously, it's a play on Stockholm, Oslo, but it reflects the perception of the possibility of this happening to an entire population or subpopulation, not just individuals. And that when you have people under chronic siege, populations under chronic siege, whether you're talking about minorities, marginalized, denigrated, perhaps physically attacked by the surrounding majority, or small states besieged by larger neighbors, then almost invariably segments of that population will embrace the indictments of their attackers, however absurd or bigoted those may be, and encourage reform of the population, or perhaps choose themselves as individuals to abandon the population, for the Jews convert to the majority religion, or even join the attackers as a way of removing themselves from the perceived taint.
Yeah.
But it basically all reflects embracing the indictments of the attackers. And the motivation is certainly to appease the attackers, but it's also even more fundamentally to have some sense of control over situations, in fact, over which they have no control. So, for example, if you look at diaspora communities, for the most part, they did not have control over what was done to them if they were attacked. Or even if you look at Israel, Israel is an independent state and in some ways a powerful state, but it does not have the power to impose peace either by military means or by concessions on its Arab neighbors. Peace, if and when it comes, will come on the Arab timetable, not on Israel's timetable. But this was intolerable for a lot of Israelis. And they wanted to believe that if only they made the right concessions, that peace could be had.
In other words, to have control, get control over the situation.
The paradigm, the real paradigm in terms of individual psychology of this phenomenon is the psychology of chronically abused children, especially young children. If you talk to psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers who work with such children, they'll always say the children blame themselves. Bad things are happening to them because they are bad. If they only become good, the bad stuff will end. Now, some people, the most common explanation offered is, well, children are naive and they're told by their abusers that they're bad. And so they just accept it at face value. And there are variations on that explanation. But in fact, there's a more fundamental explanation, and that is the existential predicament of such children. They have no escape from their situation. They can't even imagine, typically, if you're young enough, an escape. Yeah. And so they rather embrace the self-denigration that's involved in saying I'm bad, but thereby preserve the fantasy that if only they become good enough, then their abusers will end the abuse.
Yeah.
The desire for control overrides everything else. This is true with abused children, and it's true with abused adults, even abused populations.
Yep. Yeah. So it's the emotional way out of not being able to be denigrated, besieged, threatened, etc.
Yes.
Okay.
So let's talk about a population and Israel's seemingly readiness not to believe that Hamas would attack. What is the psychology of that when they'd had ample examples in years leading up to it, and yet chose to think that Hamas was changing its stripes?
Well, I think it's more distinguished between the perception of Hamas versus the perception of the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, and then the Palestinian Authority. With the Palestinian Authority, those who pushed for the Oslo Accords did convince themselves that sufficient concessions would win peace, would win genuine peace. And that was the whole rationale behind Oslo. If we give enough territory, if we make other concessions, then they can be won over. They persisted on this, even though Arafat was consistently saying that his goal was still Israel's annihilation. And even on the night of the famous handshake on the White House lawn in September of 1993, that evening he was on Jordanian television explaining to his constituency that, in fact, his goal remained the annihilation of Israel. And he said they should understand Oslo as the first step in what the PLO and then the Palestinian Authority called the plan of phases. That is, we'll take whatever we can get by negotiation, then use it as our base for pursuing Israel's annihilation. The Israelis who were pushing Oslo completely ignored that. And they completely ignored the PLO's instigation of terror in the wake of the Oslo agreements to say these were still our peace partners. Now, they never thought of Hamas as peace partners. But to acknowledge what Hamas is, and again, the sequence was Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005. In 2007, Hamas violently took over from the PA in a coup, basically. And in the wake of that, over the next 15 years, there were 4 wars initiated by Hamas, even before the horrors of October 7th. And Israel, why did they go along with leaving Hamas in place? Well, largely it wasn't because they saw them as potential peace partners. It's because the prospect of going back in Gaza was not very attractive. First of all, the one option was to go over and take it over again. But the Israelis, there was no appetite for, again, ruling over, controlling a population of 2+ million people in Gaza. An alternative was to hand it to take it over, lose the troops and so forth, and the cost of doing so, and then hand it to the PA. And that would be, in effect, exchanging one genocidal anti-Semitic organization for another, because the PA's basic objectives are no different. And that wasn't very appetizing. Even now, you see, to some degree, the U.S. administration pushing for that, still wanting the Palestinian Authority to take over when this war is finished. And but obviously Israel is very concerned about that. The third option would be to hand security in Gaza to an international force. But Israel's had horrible experiences with international forces, whether you're talking about in Sinai before the '67 war, or even in the context of Oslo, where there was an international force in Judea and Samaria, and that did not work out very well. And so that was not an appetizing prospect either. There were no appetizing prospects, no attractive prospects. And so they convinced themselves, well, maybe we can manage this by just helping Hamas administer, giving them the support, the funds, so forth, giving them access to funds to administer a somewhat restive population. In fact, the vast majority are supportive of Hamas, but there is a significant segment that is not. And so they allowed money to pour in from Qatar, particularly, and they allowed more and more Gazans to come into work in Israel and bring back those funds, and thought that this would placate Hamas. Obviously, that proved a disastrously erroneous comprehension.
And was what some of this psychology of wanting to be in control if there is actually not a way out? Is that emotional need? Was that playing a role, you think, with the Israeli authorities?
It was playing a role, again, not the way it did in the PA, in trying to ignore the hostility of the objectives of the PA, but it was playing a role in believing that this was a manageable situation, that they did not have to expend the manpower, etc., of going in and destroying Hamas in order to control the situation, in order to diminish the threat sufficiently that there would be no serious threat, or the threat would be just recurrences of these conflicts initiated by rocket attacks, which Israel can manage with its Iron Dome and its other missile defenses, and brief outbreaks of violence in response to the attacks, in which Israeli losses would be limited, very limited. And that would be a way of managing it, of controlling the situation. Well, again, it proved ultimately a disastrous comprehension.
So now Evelyn is going to move the conversation to what's going on in the United States because of October 7th. So Evelyn.
And not only in the United States.
Yes, correct.
In other countries than Israel. We see Jewish groups, like in America, Jewish Voice for Peace. It is a group of progressive Jewish pro-Palestinian activists in America that march and collaborate with the anti-Zionist BDS movement, or boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. And we see Hamas-affiliated Students for Justice in Palestine also being joined by some Jewish students, Jewish student groups. So some of these Jewish groups and Jewish students have joined marches on campus that glorified the Hamas terrorists on October 7th. These groups call Israel a colonial state, an apartheid state, and they think that Israel has no right to exist. And there are similar groups in other countries in the United States. In Holland, for instance, you have an ander Joods geluid, which means a different Jewish voice. Why are these Jewish groups and individuals collaborating with those who are actually working on the destruction of Israel? What is the psychology of that?
Throughout the history of the diaspora, again, in the context of trying to deal with anti-Jewish hatred and besiegement of Jews, you've had some elements, small elements, not only choose to identify with the aggressor, to abandon the community in one way or the other, but a subset actually joining with the attackers. It's a recurrent phenomenon. And if you look at the campuses, and Jewish Voice for Peace is mainly on campuses, although they move beyond the campuses as well. This is the zeitgeist on the campus. This is what's going on. It's very anti-Israel, and they want to be part of the majority. Basically, they want to be part of the zeitgeist. They want to be joining with the attackers, and so you see this. It's always been thus. There have always been segments of the Jewish population, and with other minorities in similar situations, people doing exactly what these people are doing. In some ways, the more problematic element is the Jewish community's tolerance, or more than tolerance, of these groups. So, for example, if you look at the campuses, you have some chapters of Hillel who at least invite these people in and try to legitimize them as voices that have to be listened to. And they talk about the big tent, and say, well, it's in Israel's interest that, or in the Jewish community's interest, that at least these people want to be part of Hillel. And so we open this big tent and be open to them. And they talk about open Hillels. But they're not there to be part of the Jewish community. They're not joining. They're joining to subvert Hillels to their perspective, so that you don't see an open JVP or an open J Street, for that matter, or an open, if not now. They want open Hillel so they can go in and essentially convert the Hillel to their message. And in some ways, the problem is becomes Hillel itself. Not that the Hillel International has strong pro-Zionist commitments and in a stated mission statement. That's a part of it. And they only have limited control over chapters, because chapters are mainly supported by the alumni of the colleges where the chapters are established. But when you have groups coming into Hillel and taking a prominent role in them that call for the annihilation of Israel, basically, Hillel could at the very least withdraw the name from them, to say they can't use the Hillel name. They can call themselves something else. But it has not taken this step. And I mentioned Hillel because they're the major Jewish legacy organization on American campuses. But there are others who tolerate these voices and allow them to join mainstream bodies and play a role when they are so nefarious, when they are so poisonous. To have a Jewish organization that calls for the annihilation of what will soon be the majority of the world Jewry, and that's what basically they're doing in the support for Hamas-related organizations on campus. And Hamas makes no bones about its desire not only to kill all Israeli Jews, but all Jews worldwide, and to claim it's a religious mission, a religious obligation. And you have Jews essentially signing on to that. They're not, to my perspective, not Jews that ought to be invited in by the Jewish community, the larger Jewish community. Yet you see elements of the community doing that.
I'd like to add here that in a conversation that Evelyn and I had with Robert Spencer in our last podcast, we also talked about Jewish organizations who are inviting Muslim friendship groups into their places without doing due diligence to find out who's funding these groups. And therefore, what's the expression in English? Inviting the wolf into the, I'm trying to think of that expression, wolf into the chicken house.
Yeah.
But so it's not just college campus, Hillel. We also have to be concerned about Jewish organizations that should be doing due diligence.
Absolutely. I just mentioned Hillel because we're talking about the greatest institutional American institution in terms of anti-Semitism. The greatest purveyor of anti-Semitism among American institutions is American academia.
Yes.
And that's why we see it obviously on the campus. That's why I mentioned Hillel.
Oh, I thought it was an excellent example, but I just wanted to kind of look back to what we've been talking about before. And then I want to talk about, as a question, an adult who should know better, who's getting huge media exposure, Norman Finkelstein, whose parents survived Nazi concentration camps. And yet he's insisting on Israel governing or policies toward the Palestinians is on the same level as the way the Nazis treated prisoners in concentration camps. And how can someone, well, you're the psychologist. I won't say the adjectives. You say the adjectives.
Well, again, I think you have to see it in the context of, certainly it falls into the category of wanting to pursue a popular attack that's popular in the person's realm of functioning, that is in academia or whatever. If you talk about individual psychology, whether you're talking about Finkelstein or Chomsky or any of these students in JVP, you can't generalize. Some of them take their positions just because they got to campus and this is what the scene is, so to speak, and they want to be part of the scene. Some of them are really following on with what they learned at home, that they had far left, anti-Zionist parents. They grew up in a maybe red diaper household, and they're just following on in the current iteration of that worldview. And others, the other extreme of the spectrum, are rebelling against parents. The parents may have been very pro-Zionist and all, whatever, they had their difficulties at home, and their way of rebelling, the way of hurting their parents, is to become violent anti-Zionists. So, but you can't generalize on that unless you have writing by the person that points you to an interpretation. You can't generalize where they came. They came from far left households, or they came from pro-Israel households. What you can say, they're certainly following the current popular trend.
Is there something before we go back to topics more related to Israel proper? Is there a way we should deal with our fellow Jews who march against us?
Yes, I think it does not help to legitimize them. It does not help to say when congregations say, and this happened with JVP, for example.
Jewish
JVP,
Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace.
Voice for Peace. They've moved beyond the campuses. There was you may well be familiar with it in I think Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. They were the instigators of the city council voting to no longer support police officers or other law enforcement officers being involved in Israeli programs to train police officers and others in terms of dealing with domestic terrorism. Now, after 9/11 in this country, it became very common for law enforcement groups, whether federal law enforcement, state or local, to send people to Israel because it has had such a horrible experience with terror and dealing with terror, to learn how to deal with it from a police, law enforcement perspective. SJP, these other groups, these pro-Palestinian groups, and anti-Israel groups, anti-Jewish groups, especially in the wake of the defund the police movement, in the wake of the George Floyd and defunding the police movement, saying, oh, well, the police that go to Israel to train are really being taught by the Israeli police how to attack blacks the way the Israeli police attack Palestinians. Still, it's totally nonsense, ugly nonsense. But then JVP was pushing this and got a law pass, or a motion passed in, I think, in Raleigh-Durham. I forget, it may have been in Durham, to stop any cooperation and any involvement in these programs. The programs were initially sending people to Israel, but then they were so successful that you had police organizations and federal organizations inviting Israelis over to the States to address large groups, on dealing with terrorism. And so this was a full endorsement. And yet, when these people who were leading this JVP chapter were called out on it, a couple local temples say, well, one of them teaches Hebrew school at our place, and one of them does another program at our shul, and these are really people who are involved in the Jewish community. Hello, they're involved in the Jewish community. They're also calling for the annihilation of Israel. So why would any congregation embrace them? But that's what was happening.
Sounds like the movie Manchurian Candidate to me.
Sorry?
The movie Manchurian Candidate. It's
yes, yes.
So is there more we can do than exclude them?
Well, I think we should call out what's evil in what they're doing and what's so destructive, and some people are doing so, but it has to be on a much larger scale. And there are many institutions, Jewish institutions, that should be calling them out that aren't. And it goes, as it was pointed out, this goes beyond Hillels. Again, Hillel I just mentioned. By far, they're not the worst offenders. You see some of this happening with other Jewish organizations. I can go into some if you want me to, but
No.
and even Daniel Gordis talks about Jewish rabbinical colleges promoting anti-Israel perspectives and pushing it with their students. Why? And why is this tolerated?
Okay. You wrote about the delusion in the Oslo Accords, which stated that Israel could trade land for peace with the PLO, and the more recent delusion that Hamas could be appeased with money and economic opportunities for Gazans. We now hear calls for a two-state solution. Do you see ways in which a two-state solution could realistically work?
It's hard to imagine it in any near term a possibility, as a near-term possibility. There was probably more of a possibility before the Oslo agreements. That I say that because when Israel was in control of the territories, and particularly in Judea and Samaria, you had a burgeoning middle class in the among the Palestinians. The increase economic well-being and income and so forth between 67 and 93, and 93 was the initiation of Oslo, was, by some measures, greater than that of South Korea or Hong Kong during the same period. And this middle class, some of its leaders, not all, many of them are still dedicated to the PLO, but some were talking about what they wanted for themselves, and they were exposed to Israel. They were traveling freely back and forth. What they wanted for themselves was an entity that would be democratic in the way Israel was democratic. And that was what they aspired to. First of all, a lot of these people felt very betrayed by Israel, but with the Oslo Accords, because they said they would talk about people who would come to Israel, often these cultural figures, leaders, and so forth, some political leaders, media leaders, and say, "Oh, great, yes, we want to help you get to a state like ours." And then they say, "But then you handed us over to these thugs, to Arafat and his thugs." And but that's what Israel did. And as soon as Arafat and the PLO came into the territories, they took over, obviously, the education system, the mosques, and the media. And they immediately started, essentially, their major theme being broadcast on all three outlets was that the Palestinians had to devote themselves to Israel's annihilation. So now you have the vast majority of Palestinians today, both in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza, having grown up, having this message drummed into them. So from that perspective, there's much less likely possibility of a peaceful Palestinian entity than there was before Oslo. And this it'll take one generation, several generations for that to change.
Right.
Netanyahu has an opinion piece in today's print Wall Street Journal, and his third point is the unradicalization of people in Palestinian-controlled areas by education. And how anyone thinks all those UNESCO books that teach hate are going to be thrown out and positive books introduced is like, would be wonderful, but I cannot see it happening.
It's not clear that anybody in the Palestinian realm has the appetite to do it. I mean, if you look at the broader Arab world today, interestingly, look at the UAE, which is part of the Abraham Accords. They have, to my understanding, largely expurgated anti-Semitism from their textbooks.
Yes.
Even the Saudi Arabia has made major advances in doing that, even though they haven't joined the Abraham Accords yet. Jordan and Egypt have the longest peace agreements, cold peace agreements with Israel, and Jordan depends on its survival in Israel. Yet they have not purged their books for various reasons. Maybe Egypt's taken a few steps in that direction, but they largely have not. And the Palestinians certainly haven't, and it's not clear who would, among the Palestinians that had any legitimacy, would lead such a movement, would lead to the changing the education system, the media system, the mosques.
Yes. You just said
We tolerate mosques. We tolerate mosques in this country where imams call for the annihilation of the Jews. Why we do that is another question. But to expect the Palestinians to abandon that propaganda, that incitement, and major segments of the Israeli elites have always refused to acknowledge the impact of indoctrination because they wanted to believe there's a potential partner there.
Oh, I see. So as we come to this end of our very interesting interview, we were going to talk, but I think we really already have talked about how Americans and others in other countries have to be careful about who they're partnering with. Unless Evelyn wants to ask a more specific question, I'm going to give you a chance to say your last thoughts. What would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, one thing I haven't talked about explicitly is the role when we talk about Jews undermining the well-being of the Jewish community, the well-being of Israel, the role of elites, which I think is important to note. And again, a lot of what we're saying about Jews in this context of besiegement and the Oslo Syndrome could be said of other minorities as well under similar circumstances. And Thurgood Marshall, for example, who was the first African-American Supreme Court justice, wrote in a case a concurring opinion in a Supreme Court case back in '77, and I'm paraphrasing it, but he said, it is well known among social scientists that the elites of minorities commonly embrace the majority's biases against their own minority.
That's
And
interesting. Would you like to
he-
explain that for
Would
those
you-
of us who
yeah.
can't quite? I
I'm
get the
trying
words.
to wrap my head around that. Yeah.
Okay, the case the case involved, like, if we have a few moments,
Yes.
the
go ahead.
case involved, it was in a county in I think it was Hidalgo County in Texas. A Mexican American was indicted by a grand jury, and the case was moving forward, and he sued, claiming that the grand jury system was biased against Mexican Americans. He said because the county population was in excess of 70% Mexican American, and the grand jury system was like around 40%. He said this imbalance was unfair. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. And Justice Powell and Marshall voted with the majority. Justice Marshall wrote a dissenting opinion saying that
Wait, you mean Justice Powell did it?
Justice Powell wrote a dissenting opinion,
Yeah, okay.
saying that that doesn't make the view of the majority makes no sense, because in fact, like most things in the county, the grand jury system was run by Mexican Americans. So how could you say it's biased against Mexican Americans? This prompted Marshall to say, well, it's well known among social scientists that elites, that is the elite running the county, and he was talking particularly of political elites and economic elites, the elite running the county, it's common that elites join with the majority in the biases against their own minority. So it would not be that unusual for the people running, the Mexican Americans running the county, to believe that for some reason Mexican Americans are less suited to sit on grand juries than Anglo-Americans. They're endorsing biases of the wider population.
So is this an example of where members of a minority, in order to get their more prestige for themselves, if they're an elite, separate themselves from the minority group that they're in? Is that what I'm understanding or not?
Yes, but it's in order to get their own, but it's because they have, in a sense, their dual loyalties built into, because they have an idea of peer loyalty. So if they're successful politicians, they identify also with other successful politicians, not just with their own group. Or if they're successful businessmen, they might do that. Now, if you look at, say, the Oslo agreements, it was a failure of all of Israel's elites, basically. The political elite, cultural elite, the media elite, the academic elite, certainly, that believed that Arafat was a peace partner. Sounds ridiculous to say, but they believed it. But why? Because look, the average cab driver in Tel Aviv does not care what a cab driver in London or New York thinks of him. The average academic in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem And the anti-Israel sentiment, of course, is not just among Arabs or the broader Muslim world. It's in Europe and academia and American academia, in the European cultural scene and the American cultural scene to a large degree. So the average academic, he wants to be invited to be a visiting professor at Harvard or Oxford, and or at least to have invited to give a lecture, that's well endowed. He's not going to do that if he's pushing pro-Israel lines. The playwright in Israel wants to have his plays performed in New York or London. A screenwriter, a director in Israel wants his films be shown at a Toronto Film Festival or Venice Film Festival. Not going to happen if he's pro-Israel.
Yeah.
So they have this built-in peer bias against their own country in a sense. And those are and elites talk themselves into believing their own convenient truths, unquote. And this was a very negative consequences for Oslo, and cost Israel dearly, and continues to.
And now that you've explained it, I understand more about some of the Jewish professors at these formerly elite colleges, why
Right.
they tend to seem like they're siding with against Israel, because again, it's always from where they are in their pecking system.
Right.
So
Right.
I think what you've just explained to our audience is very important. And I thank you really for coming on the show and explaining this to us. I hope that our listeners can take advantage of your advice in their organizations and see where they might be wittingly or unwittingly supporting these elite voices, and try not to. Did I say this correctly? Do we all agree that I voiced that concern? And for those of you who want to learn more about Evelyn and myself and our work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as we end every podcast, we say, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.